200 and it's 3:30, so I think we are right on time. If you
Okay.
want to start, Sumi.
Thank you very much, Lucia. Hello, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for an LSE conversation on feminism and the academy, thinking with at the limits of gender. My name is Sumi Madhok, and I'm Associate Professor at LSE Gender, and it's an honor and a delight to chair the LSE conversation with Gail Lewis, Clare Hemmings, and Marsha Henry. I don't know about you, but this is the absolute highlight of my 2020 events calendar. We have a packed schedule this afternoon, so without further ado, let me tell you about the order of this afternoon's LSE conversation. Gail Lewis will speak first for about 22, 24, 25 minutes, followed by Clare Hemmings and Marsha Henry will speak for about 12 to 13, 14 minutes. After which Gail will respond briefly to Clare and Marsha, and then we'll proceed straight on to Q&A, which will last about 30 minutes or thereabouts. The Q&A will be through a show of hands, and so please just indicate if you would like to ask a question. At this point, let me also introduce you to Lucia Pedrioli. Lucia is the events coordinator at LSE Gender, where she also did her MSc degree, and so many of you here would know Lucia. Importantly, she is the technical manager of this afternoon's event, and she will also help conduct the Q&A. And I'll pass it over to Lucia to go over a few technical details before we proceed. Thanks, Lucia.
Hi, nice to see you all. I see some of my old classmates, so that's really nice. I just wanted to explain that you are all muted and your videos have been turned off just to avoid disruption and keep the connection as good as possible to avoid interference. At the end, when we do the Q&A, you will be able to ask questions by using the raise hand function. So we'll see who wants to ask a question. We'll let you unmute yourself, and then you'll be able to ask your question, and the speakers will reply. So we also have the chat, but I think with so many participants, it's a bit complicated to use that as the main place for questions. So if you can, just use the raise hand function if you can. This session is going to be recorded, so if you don't want to be seen or heard, just don't unmute yourself and leave your video off. Thank you. Have a lovely event. Back to you, Zoe.
Thanks, Lucia. As I was saying to you earlier, it's my absolute honor and delight to chair this event, and my absolute honor to introduce our speakers this afternoon. Gail Lewis is Senior Visiting Fellow at LSE Gender and also psychotherapist. From 2021, Gail will be Visiting Professor at Yale University. Gail has been a long-standing member of Brixton Black Women's Group and a co-founder of the Organization for Women of African and Asian Descent, OWAD. She has been a member of the editorial collectives of trailblazing feminist journals, such as the European Journal of Women's Studies and Feminist Review. Gail is one of the foremost feminist theorists working in the field and has published widely on feminism, intersectionality, the welfare state, social policy, and racialization, citizenship and personal life, and racialized gendered experience and Black feminism. She has just recently published the wonderful article, which I know that all of you have probably seen, which is Once More with My Sister in Black Feminism and the Challenge of Object Use, which has just been published, as I said, in Feminist Review. And she's currently writing a book on Black feminism in Britain. Clare Hemmings is Professor of Feminist Theory at LSE Gender. She is the author of Why Stories Matter, the political grammar of feminist theory, and more recently of Considering Emma Goldman, Feminist Politics of Ambivalence and the Historical Imagination, and many important edited collections and journal special issues. Clare's new project draws on family tales to craft a fictional and non-fictional memory archive that draws on older work on telling stories differently. It focuses on inheritance as an unstable, unreliable, but significant resource for understanding the present, and as a potentially effective way of challenging progress or loss narratives of class, transition, white privilege, and of gender and sexual equality. Marsha Henry is Associate Professor and convener of the MSc degree on Gender, Peace and Security. She is the author of Insecure Spaces, Peacekeeping, Power and Performance in Haiti, Liberia and Kosovo, and together with Clare Hemmings and other colleagues at LSE Gender, the co-editor of the Sage Handbook of Feminist Theory. Her research interests focus on gender and development, gender and militarization, and feminist epistemologies. Marsha's work has theorized and brought race, gender, and intersectionality to the center stage of research on international peacekeeping and militarization studies. She's currently writing a book tentatively titled critical interventions on the necessity of theorizing gender and race in peacekeeping research. Okay, so I'm going to now invite Gail Lewis to begin the LSE conversation, and after which Claire and then Marsha will follow. Thanks, Gail.
Hi, thank you very much, Sumi. Thank you everyone for inviting me to do this. I miss my little lectern to hold on to, my little bit of music to introduce my mood of the day, but hey, we're gonna have to live as we do. And we all know how to watch screens, don't we? We didn't before, we do now because of Zoom. So hopefully we can kind of do this in a way that produces a sense of contact amongst us. Preliminaries to my preliminaries, it's a real pleasure to do this, but it's also a bit scary. But it comes from, really it comes from the place of totally from my sense of myself as a Black feminist. So this is from the location that I'm speaking today. And also as an old woman who now has the kind of space in a way to reflect on things, do a bit of reflection and think all of that activism, all of that mobilization and the categories under which we mobilize, do they work anymore? Are they meaningful to me at least anyway? So it's a kind of a bit of reflection back and a review, and it's not a complete paper. So bear with me, please. And this is not a paper, if by paper we mean a tightly structured, coherent argument with an ending that suggests, even if it doesn't directly claim, some kind of closed endpoint. To produce such an object is a huge struggle for me at the best of times. And since this is one of the worst of times, it's a task that is completely beyond me right now. In part, it's because of the conditions under which we labor. Cut off, enclosed in a restricted space, scared of the presence of others, even while that presence is craved and needed, constantly washing hands, covering face, staring into a Zoom camera, and invoking okayness, whether this is felt or not. We labor in isolation and in our own heads, in some grotesque performance of the bourgeois notion that ideas, thoughts, arguments are the product of some individual minds of special intellectual capacity. When in fact, ideas, thoughts, arguments, theories, descriptions emerge as a result of social interaction and lived experience and exchange, as a result of imagination and desire, even if that is in a structure of antagonism, disagreement, challenge, exploration. At least this is how it is for me. And in its absence, I feel intellectually desiccated and in need of the oxygen of discussion with physically present other persons. At the same time, that this is not a paper in the sense suggested above, is also a result of the fact that I don't know really where I'm going with these ideas, how and whether they ever could cohere into something called an argument worthy of sharing, and absolutely knowing that there is a vibrant and courageous constituency of scholars, creative practitioners, activists, who are producing profound, sensitive, impelling work, deep description, deep analysis, and coherent argument about the processes of gendering, its effects and its limits, and all implicated and operating within structures of power. So with that qualification, I offer in a spirit of open inquiry and concern, I think it's three thoughts, as a kind of gesture towards the thirsted after discussion with colleagues or co-conspirators. So portals. The focus of my concern or remarks is not whether or how gender is one of the structures central to the organization of social and psychic life. Self-evidently it is. Rather, my concern centers on the use of gender as a sign under and around which to mobilize politically in these times. I'm doubting whether it's any longer fit for purpose and what the effects of this seem to be. And of course, it's from my geopolitical social location in London, Britain in 2020 as a Black feminist. The portals that opened onto my questioning about gender as a category around which to cohere and build constituencies against the constraints of an unlivable status quo, around which to form connection in identification, or even as a first order category through which to name and describe something called experience, are several. There are the wars between trans exclusionary feminisms and trans and gender non-conforming feminisms. Wars that are bringing injury and producing proprietal claims on who can decide and be something called a woman. It comes from working with students about the implications and reach of the terms they use. What is the descriptive, theoretical, and methodological reach and effect of their key concepts, including that of gender? It comes from echoes between, though not analogous collapses into, Black and of color feminist, womanist critiques and challenges to what elsewhere I call dominance feminism, and critiques and challenges emerging from trans and non-binary constituencies and feminisms, that space, that overlap. It comes from working intergenerationally and becoming aware of the shifts in terminologies, noticing that oppression as a key term, or even an analytic, around which to mobilize, appears to me to have slipped out of use and is replaced by terms such as justice or harm. But it's in particular in relation to the last 2 points that the rest of what follows emerges. Going about my business. Tuesday, November the 10th. I need to go to the greengrocers on Newington Green to get wet walnuts and other stuff. I go, and as I drive by the green, I see a lot of people and remember that the Maggie Hamlin sculpture for Mary Wollstonecraft, 1759 to 1797, is to be unveiled. I can't lie, I've never read Vindication, apart from Marx, Du Bois, Tubman, Truth, Equiano, Douglas, and Jacobs. You get my drift. I find it hard to read 19th century texts. But a part of me takes it on trust that she was an important figure in the pursuit of justice and equality for women folk. And I love Maggie Hamlin's work. So I go to look at the sculpture and, oh dear, another white girl symbol. Maybe something vaguely unblonde about the face, but it exudes white girlness to me. Plus ça change. And it's not the nakedness or the pubic hair or the cunt, apparently there to stand for all women, because we know, Black women know, that in conditions of racial capitalism and the Atlantic slave trade and its afterlives, being in possession of those things in no way determines or guarantees entry into the category woman. In no way leads to be treated as a member of womanhood, at least according to the stated bourgeois protocols of such treatment. Plus ça change. Go back 6 weeks to Thursday, the 1st of October. I'm pottering around at home, feeling trapped and not wanting to do the work I have to do, so prevaricating. And I find I'm listening to Woman's Hour, and it's Jenny Murray's last day and broadcast on the program after 33 years. It's nice because I hear my old friend Jackie Kay and some others. I hear Joan Baez singing Diamonds and Rust. And then Jenny Murray offers her parting thoughts, still in that exemplary radio voice, that capacity to be on the mic that she has maintained for 33 years. She offers her parting thoughts. If you do a program like Woman's Hour, you have to consistently remind yourself that women are a vast range. There are many, many, many different stereotypes that fit our gender. So there is no one stereotypical woman, but our sex we share. She said, well, already this vast range is seriously narrowed by the racial positioning summoned by the injunction that one has to consistently remind yourself. Because in my ears, heart, experience, this is not something that many of us have had to remind ourselves of. We totally know it. And in that knowing, we know something about the specifics and limits of gender as a category of belonging and identity. For we know that this version of dominance feminism, to quote Green, in the article by Green and Bay, hails into the imaginary the body of a cisgender woman, end quote, who is white. But later. Now, just as an aside, let's go back to the Woman's Hour programme and note that after Jenny's parting shot, her lob into the transgender debate, comes Helen Reddy's I Am Woman, you know that song. Many of you are probably too young, but go and listen on YouTube. And now, accidentally no doubt, perhaps by Freudian slip, it all opens up again. Because think of all those persons in a vast array of bodies, bodies that signal a vast array of characteristics, singing that as a declaration of me in identification with Reddy's hailing of woman. And then again, all those persons who might be embraced by Jenny in her declaration of an irreducible sex, but who might walk on by with no recognition or walk on by with a refusal to be hailed into the terms of that sign of woman. So whether by accident or design, the expansions and contractions, the openness and closure, the porosity and fluidity of the boundaries of gender, as these articulate the racial, sexual, and indeed class logics by which we are subjectified and our lives are governed, are manifested in the quotidian rhythms and tasks of the everyday, in the radio plot, in the green that you go by as you go about to do your shopping. In the everyday, each of our everydays, everywhere. Questions. What these examples point out once again is the instability of the category gender and the need to place it under intense interrogation in order to reveal what it centers and what it circumscribes. There is a need for profound scrutiny as to its capacity to work, even as what Hortense Spiller's terms a first order naming, that is a descriptive naming capturing the experience of persons as gendered cis female or male. The scrutiny and pressure comes as a questioning as to its scope, its capacity to describe across the fractures, the fault lines and contradictions rendered by racial capitalism and heteropatriarchy on the one hand, and the need to expose its inability to speak to and out its exclusions and other violences. One effect of this scrutiny would be an at least implicit demand that gender as a nominal category be tethered to the specific constituency in whose name and image it was constituted as part of the discourse and reign of the human, to invoke Sylvia Wynter, that is, white European man and woman. So then woman becomes tethered to the human's woman, what Wynter refers to as Miranda after Shakespeare's figure in The Tempest. White European persons constituted, positioned, and inhabiting that position through their rhetorics, their knowledge frames, and their scalar and interscalar practices, running from state through corporations and institutions, right through to the quotidian of the domestic and interpersonal microsocial, the founding and living of whiteness as gendered. So the slogan might be, gender, put it where it belongs, in whiteness. Activism, ethnography, and autoethnography, theory, fiction, poetry, music, and filmmaking, etc., operating under the name of Black feminisms, has long been a site for the articulation of the pressure that I want to summon. Working to simultaneously expose the limits of the theory and politics of gender called feminism as a world of whiteness, whilst also working to expand the category and to expand that frame, making it more capacious so as to both be able to embrace the specificities of gender, woman as racialized, classed, and sexed in multiple forms, and to speak to and enfold within that the specific ways that the feminine is or isn't experienced, lived, positioned among constituencies of Black and other women of color. Black feminisms also sought to show how sex itself, sex as feminine and masculine, was constituted in the logics of racial capitalism and an array of disciplinary knowledge formations and practices through which white woman's womanness was crafted, through which it was known and offered as a subject position in a hierarchy of human value. Think of the work of James Marion Sims and his gynecological mutilations and investigations on the living sensate bodies and minds of enslaved Black women, or the display around Britain and subsequent examinations and dissection of Saatchi Baartman by Georges Cuvier, just as Julian Joseph Viret produced his discourse as to the difference between white women's and Black women's sexual organs and thus sex. On the basis of such practices of Euro-American whiteness, along with detailed scholarship on the treatment of the enslaved across the Americas, including the Caribbean, Black feminism has shown how the Black female body was ungendered, rendered flesh, and outside the bounds of woman, to use Hortense Spillers again. And this despite having what Jenny Murray would call sex, and Hamling would signal as representative of all persons called women. Gender then is a category of cis-white solipsism, and the naming of feminism otherwise as Black feminism, as womanism, of color feminism, or even intersectional feminism introduces a mode of inquiry, an angle of vision, a differently centered activism. Winter calls this a diacritical move, shifting the accent, the horizon of vision, somewhere quite else, to that of what I call dominance feminism in my recently published piece, Black Feminism and this Challenge of Object Use. So while Black and other feminists of color in one articulation may have claimed gender and woman as categories of position and enunciation of self and collective, in so doing, we have exposed the inseparability of these categories of social status, value, and subjectivization from the constitution of whiteness as a category of rule, power, and beingness. As if this was not already a huge move, Black and other feminisms of color have also pushed and expanded the categories gender and woman to their very edges, and thus shown the limited capacity of these nominations for not just inclusion, which is already a debatable desire, but more importantly, for disruption of the status quo, a status quo that in our gestures of refusal, we show are unlivable. We have exposed their impossibility to summon and address the lived and structural realities of the lives of persons not constituted as white cis women, or to frame their dreams and imaginations of other ways of personhood. And it is in their relation to their inability to foster, hold, and work with such dreaming, such imaginative power, that gender has reached its end as a category around which to politically mobilize and cohere constituencies in alliance. My claim then, or I've come to think, that gender is an inadequate sign for and of mobilization, and that this has emerged because of, one, a failure for dominance feminism to really take on the lessons of Black feminist critique about the whiteness of woman and gender, even after all these years. Because of the inability to follow dominance feminism's own logic that the idea of woman must change to sustain the rejection of modes of essentialism in this case, maybe strategic essentialisms too. 3, because of the inability to open out to and learn with and from gender non-conforming bodies and trans feminist critiques, theorizations of gendered, non-gendered personhood, and the capacities they show to live otherwise, to invoke Saidiya Hartman. And thus to review how, and the failure to review how concepts linked to activism and change, to review how the concepts linked to activism and change sometimes have to change themselves, and how maybe this one, with feminism as its ideological naming, is not capacious enough to deal with the realities of oppression, abuse, inequality in the now. To avoid a slip then into a narrowness that really hails us into whiteness, our political move must be to look to feminisms elsewhere. an elsewhere space created by Black and trans feminisms. Black and trans feminisms both sit in a vexed relationship to gender, as it is articulated as or through dominance feminism. Both speak to a rupture that reconstellates via processes of exposing gaps and of bridging a series of elements that are constituted in relation to, but separate from, gender as whiteness, woman, man. In the binary structures, gender and race, that produce normative subjects and modes of sociality, Black woman is a bringing together or bridging of two elements that within this binaristic logic and its discourse of the human is oxymoronic. Similarly, transgender. Both are, to riff off and slightly take out of context Marquis Bay, on the quote, on the run from gender, and I would add race, on the run from gender, gender understood particularly as that material and white symbolic regime of binaristic categorization. Drawing on my recent work and in tandem with that of Kai Green, I want to suggest that both Black feminism and trans are orientations in and to the world that share three key features. A once and for all disconnection between material bodies, their nominal categorization, and their presumed characteristics. The difference, say, between Black people as the discourse of policy and Blackness as a mode of living. That they share also a radical openness to what Black and trans comprise. In other words, it's not already known in advance what Black is and what trans is. It's open for political and lived inquiry. And a leaning toward the possibility, indeed a yearning toward other fugitive modes of personhood that are at present unknown and never once and for all achieved. This is, if you like, the shape of my desire after 40 years of feminist identification and commitment. It's in a space that requires a politics grounded in anti-capture of all kinds. In this specific instance of what I'm talking about here, it's anti-categorical and nominal capture, and a resistance to the modes of harm done in the name of these categories, whether this be harm from the state or from feminists or from Black radicals. It is then a politics of abolition, about harnessing the fugitive openness and radical potential in Black and trans feminisms to an emancipatory abolitionist future. Like all abolitionist desire and activism, I know this is not a once and for all achievement. I know that some will continue to claim and need to claim gender, woman, or man as a location and identity because it will be meaningful or be made to be meaningful. I know that in some senses, in some circumstances, we will need to make claims against the state on the basis of gender for recognition, for resource access, for prevention from harm. I know too, because Alyosha Tudor has reminded me so powerfully that it's not an act of will. They say, however we put it, it is evident transing gender, gender non-binary positions, and refusing and choosing in relation to gender do not make gender disappear. Instead, they underline their gender genealogies, to cite Tudor. And in that, I would say, they help us map out and define our political choices on the basis of what in the genealogical inheritance facilitates or obstructs the push toward a more ethical, caring, responsible sociality, even in spaces of uncertainty as to what is to come. And of course, the psychic and existential challenges of doing away with the very categories by which we exist are profound because, quote, it would be to feel as though we have lost ourselves. That's Marquis Bay again. The world might end. And yet for many, many, many people around the world, think, for example, of the Black diaspora formed in the wake of Atlantic enslavement, think of Palestine, think of First Nation peoples in the Americas and Australia, as some examples from many. The world has already ended many, many times. And yet we go on living otherwise, inside and alongside and outside, the conditions that would end our world again right now. So I'm suggesting that this must be our stance if we are to heed even if we even are to heed Angela Davis and see abolition as being, quote, about how we conceptualize social justice issues as always interconnected and interrelated. But more than that, if we are to take seriously the refusal to be a subject within the terms of the status quo that is simply unlivable. I've said that many times because I want to stress it. Simply unlivable. If we are to maintain the kind of radical openness to the uncertain, the not yet known, required as we try to, and that is required as we try to move toward the possibility of being and becoming otherwise, in ethical solidarity, in radical openness. All this is essential. There is no option. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gail. I'm not sure how one does sort of major loud applause on, but yes, I think Asya Islam is just.
Thank you. I hope it made sense a little bit.
Okay. Yes. Oh, yeah. I can see lots of loud applause. Okay, so I'm clearly behind on the curve here. Not sure how to do this, but this is great. Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gail. And yes, please, Claire, please do come in.
Thank you so much, Gail, for your incredibly thoughtful intervention. And thank you, Sumi, for bringing us together for this conversation, which I'm enjoying so far. And thanks to Lucia and also to Kate for the labour of putting together the Zoom event and answering reductive questions and so on. I'm also really delighted because I haven't had the chance to welcome you properly, Gail, as visiting scholar at the Department of Gender Studies at LSE, and I'm really sorry for that. And so this conversation, pandemic horrors notwithstanding, is one that I had hoped we'd be able to have in a variety of different ways over the last year. And I also really welcome an expansive conversation about gender as a category with you in particular, because you're obviously one of the key people grappling with how and to what extent we can interrogate or transform it in a context where it's so often reduced to a racialized sex binary or taken for granted as a readable aesthetic or affective range. So in my intervention here, I want to talk about gender and whiteness, or gender as whiteness, in ways that you've already set us off on, which partly comes out of reflections on an interview that I did with you, that you did for Feminist Theory, and partly comes out of my own recent work on inheritance and memory that Sumi mentioned. In the interview, with its fantastic title, Where Might We Go If We Dare? Moving Beyond the Thick, Suffocating Fog of Whiteness in Feminism, taken from one of the many insights of yours in the piece, you theorize ways in which femininity is available to white women in specific ways that rely on the historical and current construction of Black women as outside of gender. So I'm going to switch you to the third person now. In her remembering of white feminist blocking of a consistent and open attention to racism on the Feminist Review Collective, Gail Lewis reflects on the ways that white femininity's habit is to retreat into vulnerability and anxiety, even as, or precisely when, it is Black feminist concerns that are the ones being excluded. White women articulate feeling hurt, even as they are the ones aggressively policing both knowledge and the category of woman itself. As we know from Frantz Fanon, whiteness imagines itself consistently under threat, and we might say that this is precisely its mode, feeling entitled to privilege, needing to safeguard it, fantasizing aggressive others, which justifies white violence as self-defense. And white violence as self-defense is a reference to Elsa Dorlin's recent work that's been translated for radical philosophy from French. In her exquisite Imperial Intimacies, in which she tracks her family history back through the black and white British and Jamaican Carbys, Hazel Carby showcases white supremacy as time and time again a gendered scene. Fanon's bus scene is, after all, one with white mothers teaching white boys about race. Thus, while white masculinity sutures itself to a binarized maleness through one version of entitled authorship, white femininity sutures itself to the opposite through a perpetual threat of assault, whether by white or black men, by black women, or increasingly, and as Gail says, by trans interlopers. For Carby, these scenes are ones in which the protagonist, the girl, is consistently confronted with the impossibility of authorizing knowledge from outside whiteness. To lay claim to that right of authorship, as I think Marsha will also talk about, is to witness what Marilyn Fry describes as the will to obliteration. As Gail so chillingly states in her interview, quote, "They want to kill us. They are killing us," unquote. We might think of gender as whiteness not only as a historical structure, though it certainly is that, but also as an active repetition of feminine and masculine affects as part of telling stories of violence, displacement, and aggression as more heroic stories of class progress or gendered and sexual equality. In my new work on memory archives, which explores contradictory family narratives, my own family narratives, with the aim of exploring and challenging the inheritance of class transition and whiteness, I tried to take forward that attention to gender as an effectively charged set of replayed scenes. In my family, like in so many other white working class families trying to make good over centuries, women do most of the labor of storytelling and withholding that secures fantasies of white gendered class progress, even as those stories crumble and crack. In an interview this summer, under lockdown conditions, my mother tells a story of family with my great uncle Arthur as the unmarried, home-owning South Wales patriarch who bestows nest eggs on subsequent generations. Arthur is the larger-than-life character whose borderline criminal shifting of goods in the 1920s and 30s, provides for those inhabiting 64 Chepstow Road, Newport. His dock worker brother Albert and his wife Nora, and by the late 1930s, their 2 children, a young Florence Maud, Arthur's sister, my maternal grandma, Granny Liz, the siblings' widowed grandma, and old Granny Hobkirk, Nora's mum, live in the house. Arthur and his glamorous mistress occupy the first floor. Granny Liz on the ground floor took to her bed long ago, moving in after her boarding house for actors went up in flames. Auntie Nora works in the cool dairy my mum adored, selling cheese, butter, and making clothes for the entire family after her husband Albert dies. Old Nanny Hobkirk in a room upstairs, only leaving to come down for meals. We were terrified of her, says my mum. We thought she was a witch. She, quote, used to hoard rolls and rolls and rolls of material, she continues, and we both, my mum and I, laugh silly at old senile Nanny Hobkirk. God bless Arthur, she and I conclude, telling our pleasing story of a man on the criminal fringe, keeping everyone safe and sound, securing a tale of white working class grift and class improvement that I inherit. Do you need me to tell another story? The one where I discover Auntie Nora and Evelyn Hobkirk already lived at 64 Chepstow Road before Nora married Arthur. The house she bought after her husband William Hobkirk died, leaving her £2,000, who she married after Charles Workman, her first husband, died in 1918 in the First World War. God bless Nanny Hobkirk, the old witch, my mum and I echo when I finally tell her what I've discovered. You'd think me and my mum would have known better, wouldn't you? To carry and tell and revel in such a tale of gendered underwriting. In the same interview, Mum tells the story of her having to get my mum, having to get my dad's signature to use her inheritance from her mum. They used it to convert the outdoor toilet into a kitchen and install a nice new one upstairs in the 1970s upgrade to the Brighton house I grew up in that remains in my dad's name. There are plenty of other tales the women in my family tell each other that do the work of what Ray Connell calls emphasized femininity in all its storytelling, male-centered, white fantasy glory. Sticking with my mother's side just for today, my gran, Florence Maud, tells repeated tales of war and heroism that are passed on as stories to be proud of, a living legacy, in her showing of family albums to the other women and children in the family. As my brother and I perch awkwardly on the edge of the see-through plastic covers on the settee in the parlour we're not normally allowed into, we know these stories have heightened significance, that these dead men from the Boer War, from the First World War and the Second World War are honourable in a way only my brother will be able to emulate. And other whispered secrets and knowledge of violence that only circulate among girls and women. We're being taught that these honourable deaths can erase the stories of sexual violence, domestic punishments, or excessive punishments to children. We are invited to participate in familial tales through gendered knowledge that both gives them their pan-historical, nationalistic arc, but that also require that the knowledge of its interruptions be buried in exactly the same moment. Perhaps emphasized femininity doesn't quite capture this now I think about it. It doesn't quite get at the repeated gendered efforts that those not born men have to keep on making to actively tell stories of progress or loss that gloss over the fissures, bury the bodies at the same time. Alyosha Tudor describes the specific gendered epistemology of investment and erasure as the labour of misogyny, 2019. And I find that really helpful for thinking about the ways in which white femininity in my family plays out through repeated efforts to secure raced, classed and gendered fantasies, often at these women's own expense. It's helpful to think of that repetition as labour because it highlights the question of knowing erasure as a motor for progress narratives. It's my mother who knows for years before I do that my father voted Brexit, that he tried and is still trying to float his aging white masculine pride on the raft of a fantasy of violent sovereignty. She keeps it a secret to, quote, this is my mum, keep the peace. The labour of misogyny then also allows for a certain pleasure in those efforts, their shared nature, their propping up of wounded masculine pride, as of course a point of feminine pride. But I don't only want to tell an entrenched tale of white gendering that props up disappointed classed and raced fantasies that are typical of my particular demographic. To go back to Gail's interview, the secrets shared by those not born men, however gendered, however actively and aggressively refusing to acknowledge the violence they carry, are not the only trade. Gail learns the meaning of solidarity in her white working class mum's kitchen. And she cautions us that, quote, our lives are never fully encompassed and limited by all these processes and structures, unquote. If what I'm describing are gendered white scenes that scramble as well as tell a tale of British social history of the last 150 years, they are scenes I am not absent from, of course. My gendered deflection of blame for right-wing attachments has already fallen to my mum, not my dad, you'll probably have noticed, unless you have the same daddy complex I do. And if my mum is keeping secrets to keep the peace, she is keeping them from me as well as from my dad in ways that we might say cross-gender me as well as protect him. That cross-gendering might help in cracking open some of these familial gendered scenes, perhaps. I'm thinking here of a different way of telling gendered stories that starts from my mum's telling of the tale of my gorgeous grandma Florence Maud's dancing days, in inverted commas, and my brothers and my retelling of it with immense pleasure as her brothel days. Granny Liz's boarding house before the fire that pushes her into 64 Chepstow Close Road becomes the site for my own shifting identification and desire. As Florence Maud takes to the stage, I want to be Grandma with her flashing eyes and long legs, and I want to have Grandma. In my dreams and memories, I am Grandpa, as it happens, and helpfully a policeman, who wants to rescue this fallen beauty. In my youthful fairy tale, I am the one who romances her right, treats her like the princess she is, because he didn't, and because apparently it's too hard for me to do that for my mum. Or I'm the bodice ripper who knows what Grandma wants. Or I am Grandma, beautiful, spirited and caustic, battling against the attentions, or for the attentions of men, doomed to a life in which she only makes use of a fraction of her considerable talents. I am the narrator in my memory of scenes, both real and imagined, of all the grandma and grandpa plots the restrictions of genre will allow. Can these and other scenes of gender and fantasy that pivot on and reject the incest taboo, it's grandma after all, that intervene within histories of transitional progress and heteronormative white gendering, give us a chance to tell our stories differently? Can we open up more genres for gender? Thank you.
Thank you. Amazing. Thank you so much. Wow. Okay. Yes, and I'm seeing the hands appearing, which is fantastic. I still have to kind of figure out how to do that. Yes, please, Marsha. Marsha, to come in.
Oh, thank you so much. Claire has already thanked all of the people who have been involved in this, but what people don't know is that Sumi has actually been the sort of catalyst for starting this conversation, and so much of the conversation that we've had in the background, in the preparation for this, has been very much inspired by ideas that Sumi had, and put together this conversation in particular. So I'm very grateful. I mean, how to follow these beautiful articulations and to contribute to the conversation in a meaningful way. I am both daunted and humbled by the task of engaging in this dialogue with these three scholars, if I can include Sumi in that. I start from talking about what I see as the promise, pitfalls, and potentiality of gender as a concept and as a vehicle for theorizing lived experience, and how I think we can potentially re-inhabit gender from alternative but familiar theoretical and scholastic rootings. Rootings that have been already and always available through other bodies of scholarship, for example, through critical race theory or Black feminist theory. More recently, I've been trying to make a small contribution and do some of this work to challenge trends within gender studies by revisiting and repoliticizing the concept of intersectionality, for example, and something that I touch on very briefly towards the end. My reading of the development of feminist theorizing and the life of gender as a concept is that it diverged from the category or label of sex provided a much needed response to the essentialist and problematic understandings of why women were widely considered the second sex through notions of biological destiny. And this directly enabled scholars to argue that women's socially disadvantaged position and marginalized experience was a result of systems and structures of male domination and power. Feminist accounts of a different world, drawing on standpoint theory, for example, provided a counter to positivist approaches to knowledge production. For me, as a student of women and gender studies, reading the work of Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, and Patricia Hill Collins, to name a few, provided a promise of feminism that I could find myself enfolded in. I could see myself belonging to a community and to a project of social transformation through reading these and other scholarly works. Having been exposed to Black feminist theory and subsequently critical race scholarship early on in my feminist education, meant that I came to know feminist and gender theory as one that was already interconnected or interlinked, as some of the work of Shireen Razik suggests, intersectional, as the CRC and Crenshaw talks about, and as transnational, world traveling scholars like Maria Lagonas and Gloria Anzaldúa, and that it was not only under Western eyes that we needed to think through a gender, but that this other scholarship provided a full account, or at least a fuller account, of the multiplicity of oppressions and privileges. Despite this initial exposure to a more inclusive and diverse feminist education and consciousness, I have found myself in a multitude of spaces of late that remind me of the continual pitfalls that the concept of gender produces and reproduces, and the foreclosures that are continually visible when gender becomes the property of particular fields of study and practice. When gender is in what I would call the wrong hands, perhaps. A semi-recent experience that I want to share with you. In late 2018, I was invited as a special guest as the then director of the Center for Women, Peace and Security at LSE to attend the ceremonial opening of the formerly named towers, 3 buildings on the LSE campus. They are now called Fawcett House, Pankhurst House, and Pethwick Lawrence House. Buildings named in honor of suffragettes and their work and the physical location of their place of political organizing in London. The ceremony had many parts, but I can equivocally say that it was an entirely white affair in terms of speeches, leadership, and photo opportunities and subsequent media releases. I was asked upon arrival into the building where the ceremony was being held if I could help out with one part of the event. Put on the spot by the PR person in charge of managing the event, I accepted to be the host of the almost exclusively all-white academic, women academic group that had gathered to one side of the ceremony hall. I quickly introduced myself and already knew many of the individuals present, my colleagues in feminist scholarship, many of my colleagues in feminist scholarship. None, if you're going to try and find out who they are, you can look it up if you like, but none of them were from the Department of Gender Studies. I quickly learned the names and affiliations of a few others and readied myself to present my colleagues to someone very important. Armed with as little information as I could have been, a member of the royal family suddenly appeared, and I jumped forwards, ready to do the work of colonized domestication that I found myself in. Please note that I was physically anchoring the beginning of what was a horseshoe of white women that ended with a Black woman colleague who I subsequently became friends with. So this is the positive outcome, positive and unintended consequence of this. Almost like 2 lion statues at the entrance of a driveway of a stately home, I attempted to narrate the arc of feminism and gender work by presenting my colleagues. I found myself surprised at how quickly and easily I acquiesced into the role of servitude by virtue of not wanting to cause ripples. Within seconds, I was physically and verbally erased as a senior member of the university and the royal family member took control of the tour, not even meeting my gaze or acknowledging who I was. Keep in mind, I am wearing a massive badge on my chest that said director, which made no impression. And closing the physical gap between them and my colleague beside me, I was in effect royally snubbed. Later on, my Black feminist colleague, who had some time to prepare what she would have to say to the VIP team, recounted the horror she experienced witnessing such a bold display of racism. Photos sent to me afterwards by the official photographer evidenced the immediate feeling of being cast off and ignored. I looked positively gloomy in these grainy photos, fuming maybe even the grounds for being a feminist killjoy evident in my eyes without me even knowing it at the time. As the tour took off and the VIP couplet began to finalize their introductions to university faculty and staff, official speeches abruptly began. Speech after speech heralded the work of white suffragettes and covered the supposed and included coverage of the supposed gender issue of our times, namely which white woman writers should be on British currency, which woman writers should be on pound notes. All the references in the speeches, all the gags and laughs and innuendos confirmed and reproduced the center, the perspective of white heteronormative middle-class knowledge as the norm, as the everyday. The feminism that I heard in the speeches resembled nothing of the texts and ideas that I had been exposed to. There was no mention of the women who participated in the suffrage campaign who did not fit the mold of a very specific gender binary and ableist form of feminism. There was no space for talking about intersectionality. Unlike the vibrant political activism, unlike the vibrant feminist political activism seen by such organizations at the time and movements such as Sisters Uncut, the vibrancy of intersectional and other feminist theories was not evident, was not present. The potency of gender and feminism reduced to simple representations of white bourgeois feminism that make us feel that we are in sort of a feminist Groundhog Day. As Hemmings and Lewis write in their article that Claire just was talking about, I think when writing this about the phrase, the thick, suffocating fog of whiteness. I stood, shame burning out my body, smiling stupidly and listening to narratives which included the words gender, feminism, rights, enfranchisement, all the while knowing that I was not in any way visible, noticeable, or present. I literally slipped away from the crowd and returned to my office, closing the door and thinking to myself, how the hell did I get here? What a strange contrast I experienced to feelings of belonging that often structured my earlier feminist education, at least in terms of my engagement with texts that spoke differently to questions of gender and other axes of difference. How had I not noticed what Alyosha Tudor refers to as the hostile takeover of feminism's key theories? In attempting to address these hostile takeovers, I had been in my own academic writing returning to what I saw as the problematic use of the radical and critical feminist concepts, such as intersectionality, in the service of fields of study and institutional programming. I reflected, for example, on how intersectionality had become so popular a concept that it was introduced in Canadian international assistance programming. It was also found in feminist critical military studies and related fields, and was being introduced in order to better understand the experiences of marginalized military masculinities in the Israeli armed forces. The appearance and acceptance of intersectionality as a useful device with which to understand the multiplicity of forms of racialized and gendered control in military institutions had to mean that gender scholars were utilizing feminism's key theories in loose and problematic ways. And in many cases, this scholarship paid no attention to other Black feminist scholarship, and in most cases did not even reference, if we want to reinforce the ownership of intersectionality, to Crenshaw at all. So I want to conclude with thinking about where promise lies. And for me, promise lies in thinking differently from the outset. Why not pause to think of gender via critical race feminism, or from inside trans studies, as both Claire and Gail have suggested? These bodies of scholarship are already doing this conceptual labor, this labor of misogyny, as Claire talks about in relation to Tudor's work, both examining pitfalls as well as trying to avoid them by paying attention to the potency and vibrancy of other emerging thinking. Of course, this rerouting doesn't guarantee that we do not use and abuse gender in much the same way that I argue has been the case with intersectionality in a number of fields and disciplines. Nor does it necessarily help us when right-wing and gender-critical writers attempt to evict some from the field itself. So as scholars Evelina Mbachi and Krugel and Zaleski suggest, retrospective reinjection of politics and power into our understandings of how gender both works and is resisted seem to be part of our necessary rerouting back to gender.
So great. Thank you so much, Marsha. Okay, Gail, back to you.
Oh gosh, this is hard. Thank you guys for those great papers. I mean, I don't know how to respond really, because it's like I need a cup of tea and think, you know, sit in that kind of way. And there was so much thought there. I suppose the first thing I just need to say, exactly, Marsha, that's why we can't be doing with these people. They're done. Let them have their stuff. Let them do it, because we got work to do. We got lives to live. Sure. I want to be a bit Jamaican about it, you know. I mean, give me a break. But what's so terrible is, it seems to me, and partly what's led me here is just a comment, is that it seems to me those kinds of incidences have gained ever increasing prominence in the last 4 or 5 years. Or maybe with in my head, in this country, it's kind of travels alongside Brexit, and in the US, Trumpism, that what's been unleashed and what's allowed, and that those women are occupying their whiteness and parading it with absolute violent authority. Be done, but notice it. Okay, so there's that. But I suppose what I wanted to ask you about was, because it seemed to me that when you were saying at the end about relocating into other groundings, in some senses there was a bit of an overlap, parallel to kind of what I was gesturing to. I think you want to do it to hold on to gender. I want to get rid of gender as a political mobilizer. I'm thinking about what gets us in the streets almost, if you know, kind of that kind of thing. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about what happens, do you think, to the category? Can the category be sustained if it is so relocated into, say, critical race or queer? So that I'd say ask you. And then with Claire, I might as well ask these together. Is that right, Sumi? Just, yeah. With Claire, thank you for the beautiful stories, both of you, for the stories. I mean, storytelling is such a generative ground, though, for sparking imagination. I think I was wondering about, because you talked about whiteness as I think, or gendered whiteness perhaps, as a structure of repetition. Yeah, is that right? Did I get that right, Claire? Yeah. And then a repetition of affects. And then when you talked about the dreams, it seemed to me that you took us into the area of feelings, emotions, desire as feeling emotion. I'm drawing a distinction between affect, which I think of as a, well, I'm needing to back up on myself. Often in my mind, I'm doing a shorthand kind of thing between the conversation between psychoanalytic thinking, where dreams and what that helps us to see about unconscious desire and the way in which feeling and emotion is in dreams or carried by fragments of a dream, and that speaks to something that's a bit more unconscious, harder to get a hold of, but absolutely has a force, as your account showed us, a force into structuring the microsocial, the the familial, the domestic, and then as that scales out into property and relations and all that. So something about that, and the distinction between that and affect, which I think of as a more sociological term, if you like, that keeps things a bit more out there, a bit more, we're moved by the force of something external to us. And it seemed to me that what your paper took us to was how we have to think about gendered whiteness, or whiteness as gendered, through a complex and perhaps competing struggle between something all to do with the on the terrain of the felt, but one with affect, which seems to me a bit external and a bit distant from what needs to be caught, as opposed to dreams that take us into the very quality of what it means to be a gendered, racialized class subject. And so what's the language we need to use? That of the psychoanalytic dream work stuff more, or the sociological structural affect? Is affect enough, really, as a terminology, given what you took us to, and the structure of desire as, you know, totally into Freud, being and having. I mean, you took us there. You want to be and have. So what's the terminology that we can use? Okay, here's the question. What's the terminology we can use and the theoretical inheritances that we can use in order to either abolish gender or expand it in ways that disconnects it from whiteness and still holds on to the interiority of it as subjects, the feltness inside? Probably not clear, sorry. So should we all be on this? Should we all be unmiked for this, Marsha?
I think you can go for it, Claire and Marsha, as you see fit. Yeah.
Go ahead, Claire.
Or we can just go to Q&A.
I think I don't mind. I mean, I think. Well, thank you anyway to both of you for being just generally so fabulous. I guess yeah, I think what you're saying is incredibly thought-provoking and helpful, Gail, about how to untangle the relationship between structure. I mean, apart from the affect and the desire question, there's also the kind of, how do you navigate wanting to do justice to thinking about gender as whiteness as a structure that does particular work and enables particular things to happen, that are both socio-historical and navigated in and through both embodiment, familial engagements, intersubjective drama, and so on and so forth, without somehow generating those as opposed. Because I suppose one of the things I want to say is that you know, that fantasy of the fantasies of progress, or of class progress in particular, that do happen at certain points but also fail at many other points, that generates a kind of desire for sovereignty that in many, I mean, it's not the only basis of a desire for sovereignty, but it's certainly one of them, is that disappointment. That is a gendered as well as raced scene, that there's never a point one doesn't participate in some form in the familial drama I'm generating. And I suppose I'm trying to think about, I'm using affect as a way of trying to describe that relationship, even though, as you say, it probably is better used to describe the structure. I think partly I'm doing that also because I suppose I see the forms of gendered desire and projection, say, would be the other way of thinking about it, particularly around aggression, right? In terms of part of how the affective structure of white gender consolidates itself.
Yeah, fair.
And so then I wouldn't want to use one or other term, but to focus on that dynamic, I guess. I don't, yeah.
Yeah, maybe just, you know, in kind of connection with everything that has been said, I was just thinking about this. You know, on the one hand, I think in thinking about what you said, Gail, about sort of leaving gender behind, or, you know, abandoning it or whatever, maybe not paying it any attention for a bit, as, you know, Zaleski talks about taking a break from feminism as a way of, you know, creating space to articulate lived experience much differently. And I think, you know, you make such a convincing case. I guess one of the things I want to say is I kind of I refuse to see, I refuse to let white feminism own gender, because that's not been my entry into it. I mean, that's not to say that I haven't also navigated the different texts and scholarship through frames that, you know, I now find problematic, or I continually define problematic. So, but I guess it's the telling of gender, or my education into gender has always come through these, you know, through the multiplicity of axes of oppression, actually. And so on the one hand, I kind of refuse that dominant narrative, but I also think that in order to move away from it, to critique it, and to re-inhabit it, one needs to kind of keep it there, keep it in the line of sight. And so I guess there is a real ambivalence about gender. One is, first of all, refusing a particular history and genealogy of it, and you know, which Claire does, I think, so brilliantly, and, you know, in terms of how we tell the story about it. Even the way I told the story about my entry into it was inadequate in terms of dealing with these labels, because we can't even speak about gender without reproducing it, you know. But so I think that there's an effective motivation too that I can't explain well. And I think that, that the use of gender, you know, as Marsha Zaleski wrote in 2009 or 2010, that, you know, gender is both this theoretical lever and the empirical evidence to get rid of gender, is something that, you know, we hold both at the same time, so that, you know, it's this thing that we want to get rid of, but that we need to keep raging against. So I don't know, that doesn't satisfy any of the sort of anxieties that we might have about the concept, but maybe tells you something about the continued ambivalence. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to come in now and sort of move us to the third part of the afternoon. But before I do that, can I just sort of say thank you for the inspiration. Really, what an inspirational afternoon it's been this far, and we haven't even gone into the Q&A yet. So it's been just outstandingly inspirational. And in these bleak times, my God, it is inspiration. I mean, we could do with some inspiration to keep moving. Okay, so I'm going to now invite questions through Q&A, and I'm looking for Lucia. There you are, Lucia. And I'm also going to exercise chair's privilege here and say that on my clock it says we have about 18 minutes, but I did announce that we would have just, you know, 30 minutes or thereabouts, so we would kind of extend it by, say, 7 or 8 minutes, okay, so that we are, you know, meet the criteria of thereabout. Okay, so okay, yes, please. So Lucia, have you seen some questions already?
So the first question is from Emily. I'm going to unmute you. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Before you go ahead, Emily, and others who are wanting to ask, can I just say, can you please very quickly say your name and try and keep your question really brief, because we would really like to get as many questions in as possible. So thank you very much. Okay, yes, please, Emily.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I didn't realise I was going to be the first question. That's a bit strange, but thank you so much. Yeah, it has been really, really rich afternoon. I was listening, and actually I've been kind of inspired anyway by all of your work around the concept of gender. And I was listening to the ways that you yourselves were deploying the concept of gender during your presentations. And I was wondering what you think the conceptual properties are of the concept of gender. Does gender itself have its own agency, or is it about people using and doing things and stretching and pushing and pulling at gender? So in a way I'm asking, what's your theorization of concepts, I think? But yeah, do you think gender can do stuff on its own, or do we have to do stuff with it? Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Emily. I'm actually going to collect a few questions. I should have said that at the start. So could I have about 2 more questions, please, and if briefly as possible. Thank you. Lucia, can you identify 2 more? You're mute, Lucia.
Oh, sorry. I think I asked Azia to unmute herself. And
yeah. Hi, thank you for this wonderful event. So just going to what Gail Lewis started with in terms of stating your positionality. I studied in India women's studies and then came to LSE and was taught by brilliant scholars, many of whom are here today. So there's a particular entry point that I had, as Marsha already said in her comments after Gail's response, into gender studies. And I think in that sense, I've built a world of gender studies for myself, which can sometimes be called a bubble. And that bubble would include, for example, closely engaging with Black feminism, closely engaging with intersectionality, and to that extent, I've not felt the need to do away with gender. So the question that I want to ask is, what's the role of denial and refusal and the relationship between the two in the way we think of gender, in the way we build a world of gender, in the way we tell stories about gender? Because I think to a certain extent, it's denial in not seeing gender and feminism as just white and closely engaging with other stories of gender, but at the same time, it can also be a much more willful act of refusal. So what's the relationship between denial and refusal in thinking about gender? Thank you.
Thanks, Asia. Lucia, can you identify 1 more, please? Thank you.
we have Daniela.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I'm speaking from New York. I'm a doctoral student at CUNY, the Graduate Center in Gender and Latin America. And I'm thinking of Gender Scott, the influential paper, Gender as a Useful Category of Historical Analysis. And based on what you said, don't you guys think that the central question here then should be how to better unpack or how to historically deconstruct gender if that very category has been historically constructed as a gendered whiteness? Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Shall we take these for now and then go back for another round? Would you say, is that okay? Okay, yes, please. I think all the questions were kind of I think they were directed at all 3 speakers, I would think. So yeah, as you want to come in and answer them or address them, I'll leave it to you.
Those are all really, really tough questions. Thanks, Lucia. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, I think I'm not sure I can say anything meaningful, because I think those are all brilliant questions that we could, continue to have a whole workshop on, 101 uses of gender. What should we do with it? Or, I don't know. I think I like the question. I like all 3 questions, but I mean, I like the question about, can gender do stuff on its own? I just know that that's one of the struggles of talking that we've experienced talking about gender today, because we give it a life of its own. We make it animated in certain ways. And I try and do stuff with gender, but I often collapse into using gender as if it has its own agency and autonomy. And so I think the you know, it's such a messy concept, and it's such a difficult concept to grasp sometimes. And I think, yeah, so I'm sorry, that's just a little bit of a starting to think about the questions, but not really reaching any conclusions.
But maybe I think concepts, terms animate. I think they do animate. Perhaps because I've came through social policy, and policy practitioners work to terms in some sense, and they're animated by it, and they devise things. I think one of the powerful effects of feminist organizing has been to place gender as an idea, a concept, a category, lob it into the world where it now animates. It does stuff. My problem is, and in that it does stuff, it has, if you like, a life of its own. Okay, it has a life of its own. My problem is that now, well, I think it actually was ever thus. I think it's a life of its own, and one of the aspects of its life of its own is that it summons implicitly a figure called a white woman, not even white men necessarily. I know there was all that stuff where we've got to go to gender studies in order to, but you know, it slides into a feminine location within whiteness. Okay. And I think therein lies its toxicity. And I think now, well, I think all the work that we all did, you know, Marsha, you talked about being introduced to feminism through Hill Collins, you know, all the etc. And all the work that we were doing all the time was to say, listen, girls, you've got to make it a bigger category. You're not the only ones who are called women and everything. We've got to do this. We need to expand it. It needs to be more inclusive. Get on, stop with your racism, or stop with your closed vision and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Stop with your classed vision. Open up to lesbian sexualities, you know, all of that stuff back in the early days, especially. Okay. And now we're in 2020, and it's clear to me that it has not been able to do that. And your story, Marsha, shows us is one example of how it's not only not been able to do it, it's retreated behind its battle lines into a kind of entitled omnipotence. As Claire said, always under threat of some masculinized figure, you know, in vulnerability, but with an entitlement to do and say what it likes in the name of gender, if you see what I mean. Figures gendered as well, do what they want in the name of gender. So yes, of course we have to deconstruct it. Of course we have to look at the ways in which it's constituted in particular locations at particular times. And by locations, I don't just mean geographical locations. I mean institutional sites, domestic sites, school sites, in the street site, at the bus stop, all of that kind of stuff. And we absolutely have to, and we have to pay attention to all the violences that are done against figures called women. And I'm not going to do a cis and trans, against figures called women who identify as women. We have to do all that work, absolutely. But for me, is that the category around which we politically mobilize? Is that the category around which we say, hey, folks, we need to mobilize say we need to call for defunding of the police in relation to how the police deal with domestic abuse, say. Under what sign do we do that? As gender activists? For me, because of the history of what it now summons, no. It can't be done. So that's what I mean. It's not that we don't do gender studies work. It's how do we mobilize? What is our slogan, if you like? You know, I'm an old Marxist. And I was, not only am I an old Marxist, I was a Maoist at one point, and slogans were 3 sentences long, you know. But the point is what's the slogan? What's the term that can, it can't be fixed once and for all. It can't. Language doesn't have that capacity, but is it enough to kind of be capacious enough to say, I can go with that? Now, what the things that seem to be around when I ask younger people, they talk about harm reduction, say, for example, or abolition, you know, and stuff like that, or manifestations of justice in different kinds. I don't know what the terms are, but my point is gender now is so laden with its history in the last, I don't know, however many decades of feminism, and so, where it's linked to whiteness as a structure of imperious power and violence that is at the fore again at the moment, that I think we can't mobilize under it. So that's my point, really. Sorry, it's a lot of feeling in it because I feel it.
Just a very brief comment, I guess. I don't think that gender has its own agency. But I do think it has a history that is neither fully closed nor fully open. And I think that history and present also requires different work of different participants in the field, depending on location and intention as well. So I think that there's a different kind of labor that I think is important for me to do as a white woman who occupies privilege, both because of that and also more in other ways, to try and I think it's a different call to say that it's important I don't cede that category, because we have barely even begun, or I have barely even begun to scratch the surface of what it means then to be a feminist who is white and who is wanting to untangle and come to terms with the aggressive denial of its whiteness that lies at the heart of gender as an oppositional category. And I think that's a different kind of work, but it's a work that I think, so I'm not sure that there's, I think that then when asking questions about what kind of work does gender need to do, or what do we want gender to do, I think those things might also have, might have different answers, in part because I think that there is also another set of white fantasies, which is that somehow one could finally disentangle oneself from that history in ways that mean that you could sort of, as another set of, in a way, a bit like my ending, right? That I could imagine myself somehow opening up a scene that wasn't also about accountability for the aggression, I think is at the heart of those oppositions. So I think, yeah, so I'll just leave that there. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, Luch, I'm going to collect 3 more questions, but this will be the last round of questions. So this is your chance now.
We have a question from Doris.
Yes, please. And can you see the 3 more? So if I can just announce their names now so that they are ready with their questions. So it's Doris.
I think we have 2 legacy hands from people who had questions before, but if more people want to ask questions, please let us know.
Okay, so it's Doris. Yes, please go ahead, Doris. Doris, we can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Oh, is that better?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. I'm doing a PhD in women's studies and sociology in University College Cork in Ireland. And I'm investigating sex workers and their experiences of care and caring relationships. I was just interested in something that Gail mentioned when you were talking about abolitionism and that, and you mentioned a radical openness kind of to the unknown. I was just wondering, like, what practical steps can we take to building a radically open community?
We have another couple of questions. Let me try and help.
So there's, yeah.
Deborah?
So there's Deborah.
Yes.
There's Deborah and
Kushi?
And Kushi, did you also want to ask a question? Yes. Okay, so we'll come to you in any event. We'll come to you. We'll come to you after Deborah's had a chance. Go for it, Deborah.
Okay. So I am an assistant professor and postdoctoral fellow in a faculty of law in Canada. And one thing that I was reflecting on as I listened to the very interesting talks, thank you to everyone, is really the distinction between sex and gender that the law draws. And in particular in Canada, the word sex is the word that we've used traditionally and historically to guarantee human rights protections to that group of people we call women. But now in Canada in particular, we have created gender identity and gender expression as protected characteristics, but the word gender doesn't appear anywhere in that legislation, and yet it's doing a significant amount of work. So just as we have a conversation here about theoretically whether gender is even meaningful at all as a category, we have the law just beginning to embrace gender as a protected characteristic. And so I guess some observations on, back to the original question, right? How do we define what we mean when we talk about gender? Because we haven't talked about sex, and yet in the law, sex is the protected characteristic that's done a lot of this work. So that's just an observation from the legal side.
Thanks very much, Deborah. Yes, please, Kushi, go for it.
Okay, I was really confused about asking this question because I think I myself am not clear about what I want to ask. Okay, so I'm Kushi. I'm a doctoral student at Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. I study women in diplomacy. One thing, like, which is just staying in my mind is that, you know, this whole journey of being a feminist and becoming a feminist, and what, as Asya said before, you know, all the texts that I'm reading, and they are so located in this racialized inequality, which is so true, and class and everything. But as a brown woman, an identity I very recently came to know that I possess once I entered this international sphere of scholarship, then it's this whole journey of becoming that feminist and understanding gender in that sense. And, you know, how do you see it? How do you tell someone who is a young feminist who's for the first time getting exposed to this, you know, this global world of where we are talking about gender, but hasn't experienced that racialized inequality, but has experienced the caste, which is a very domestic space of, again, a certain kind of very grave inequalities over where my caste position is a privileged caste position. So for me personally, when I enter this conversation on feminism and gender, I just don't know where to, you know, move around. I think my question is not very clear, but I simply, what would you tell someone who's navigating, you know, coming suddenly into this, as Asya said, this bubble of international feminism, and we are talking about gender, but a lot of what it talks about is not what I have lived. And for me, the first stage of identifying myself is as a woman. And as I'm growing, I feel my idea of gender will just keep changing as I'll keep growing older and I'll keep engaging more and more with the scholarship. I don't know if I was coherent enough. So thank you.
Thank you. That was, thank you. Yes, you were. You were very coherent. Thank you so much, Kushi. Okay, yes, please.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Gail, Claire, and Marsha, you have about maybe 3 minutes to answer these huge questions. But yes, go for it. And I think, again, the questions were directed at all three speakers, is my sense. So yeah, I'm happy for you to take them up as you please. Yeah.
Are you going, Claire?
I wasn't going to.
No, sorry, I thought you. I mean, this is, anyway, I don't know where to go, I have to say, and that's nice. I kind of like that. I don't know. I think I note the thing that I think it's Deborah said about Canada and about what the law is just doing now, and what it the sex is a term but gender is not. Is that right, in this particular legislations? And yeah, I mean, there are the kind of deployment of these terms, these categories will be differential depending on their own location, if you see what I mean. I don't mean, again, not just national location, but this is in the law for a particular purpose in response to, I guess, a set of demands and an attempt to respond to that. And I suppose the logic, I think, would be to say not should they or shouldn't be there in this context, but what work are they doing in relation to both what put them in the legislation in the first place and what the effects will be, and how will those effects be racialized, part of a colonial structure in relation to First Nation people, you know, how expansive can they be, and with what effects generally. I mean, I think that's the thing to look for, I would say, just off the top of my head. So it's about the critical interrogation of the work that the terms are doing in a particular context with a particular purpose. In relation to how do you, I think that's the struggle. The struggle is how, in terms of what steps can we take towards a radically open community now? I think that is very much part of the issue that exercises many of us involved in what we might call Black study, to follow Fred Moten, etc., where we're trying to think through both how does one live simultaneously both as a subject under the status quo of the range of normativities that produce us. So how do I live as something called a Black woman, a Black queer woman, you know, whatever that be. And at the same time, how do I identify those aspects of my living that are under the radar of those nominal captures? That Black woman, anybody who's been in my classroom with me, who I've taught, will know I never, ever, ever stop going on. Look, I'm a Black woman and I'm going to use that location to teach you something so that we can have a conversation. So they'll know I constantly inhabit that position. Okay. Now today I'm saying it's an oxymoron. You know, it's oxymoronic. Okay. As I live it. But at the same time, what aspects of my living in relation to others are out with those categorizations and not locatable in any of them other than this field that we call Blackness. Blackness as a mode of life. So I don't know, those of you who are in Britain, I don't know if you saw the second of the Steve McQueen films on Sunday in the Small Axe series. I don't know if it was called Lovers Rock, but it was a night at a blues dance, what we call a blues dance, and it was Lovers Rock. Okay. what you see there, you see all sorts of gendered dynamics and sexualized dynamics and stuff. But what you see there, especially when the dance really keeps going, is a enactment of blackness under the radar of the categories through which black bodies are known. There's a way in, and it's a total mode of sociality. And it was totally recognizable. And so what I think I'm saying is that the task is to seize, or no, to help us each other to hone an observing eye, a sentience towards the feeling, the structure of feeling, to invoke Raymond Williams, I guess, in a moment, in constituencies that are non-normative or trying to live non-normative lives. And then we see we can be radically open to that. And then we see if we can harness that in towards something else as a mode of being, always in the interstices of the regimes of rule and governance and subjectification. So, and I think that's what we mean, that's what within Black feminism, when we're talking about modes of fugitivity and futurity, the fugitivity is the under the radarness, the futurity is what can we put in place now in order to make it possible that something else, which is not yet known, might emerge. That's the task, and that pays attention to how can we do some subversions that don't call up new modes of categorical capture. That's, I think, what we have to do. I think, just completely off the top of my head, but I think that's what we have to do. Something like that. And the thing about it is that is what's happened. The reason why I directed to the Steve McQueen film as a filmic example of blackness as lived in London in the late 70s, not as Black people, if you see what I mean. Sorry, I was more than 3 minutes.
I'm so happy to just leave that beautiful expose on blackness and conviviality and the joy, Black joy, which I think is behind that. So I'm already spoiling what you've just said by saying any more, so I'm going to shut up.
Me too.
Okay. You're muted, Gail.
Can we get the chat? Because the chat will disappear when... Can it
we
be...
can save it.
Because it'd just be nice to see, you know, because I haven't been able to see that.
Yeah, we can save the chat.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
And just because there've been a lot of queries about whether this would be recorded. Most likelihood, yes, but you know, most likelihood. I'll just leave it at that to create some you know some kind of palpable anticipation for what is to come, right, in that spirit, or what is to come. So this is one of the great things about LSE Conversation is that these are conversations, right, and they're continuing. So this is not the end, and this is not, you know, and I think that's what we were hoping for, that this would generate that you know, a space for us to think and continue to think along some of these really inspiring sort of lines that have, or roots that Marsha, Gail and Claire have laid out for us today. And I also wanted to sort of, before I go on to thank Marsha, Claire and Gail, properly, I wanted to also say thank you to the audience, right? Thank you to all of you for being here, for your amazing questions, for wonderful, thoughtful comments that I've been trying to read through as they're coming through on chat. We've been a gathering of 250 people, you know, and that is an amazing gathering in these times, right? And so I also want to thank Lucia Pedrioli, you know, for being this amazing manager, to manage the whole event, and for all the labor that has gone in to putting this event together, along with Kate Stewart and Becca White, also who is the you know, who is the social media person who does amazing you know, work in getting all this stuff out there into the world. So thank you very much, Gail, Claire, and Marsha. Our time's up for this afternoon, I'm afraid. But as I said, this is an ongoing conversation you've set us on, and we're just going to be keep bothering you now. I'm afraid there is no sort of respite or sort of any place for you to hide. You know, that's it. You've just got us on your backs now. That's it. But then that's what you've done to us this afternoon. Completely and totally inspired us. And thank you so much for inspiring us and taking us to a ethical space whereby we might remake solidarity, sociality, politics, mobilization, knowledge production, and I can keep going on, but I know that the time's moving on and I've got to stop as well. And to do all of this by telling different stories, which might lead us towards an emancipatory abolitionist future and away from categorical capture. I just love that term, categorical capture. Okay, so here we go. I think that Gail, Claire, and Marsha and me and Lucia probably stay on, but I think it's bye from us to all of you for now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye for now. Bye. Bye-bye. Have a very nice afternoon.